On June 30th, 1908, the inhabitants of a small village in central Siberia saw a bluish-white streak of fire cut vertically across the sky to the northwest. What began as a bright point of light lengthened over a period of 10 minutes until it seemed to split the sky in two. When it reached the ground, it shattered to form a monstrous cloud of black smoke. Seconds later, there was a terrific roaring detonation that made the buildings tremble. Assuming that the day of judgment had arrived, many of the villagers fell on their knees and prayed. Their reaction was not entirely absurd. In fact, they had witnessed the greatest natural disaster in the Earth's recorded history. If the object that had caused what is now known as the Great Siberian Explosion had arrived a few hours earlier or later, it might have landed in more heavily populated regions and caused millions of deaths. As it turned out, the village of Tunguska had been over 200 miles away from the impact point, and yet the explosion had been enough to shake the debris from their roofs. The Trans-Siberian Express train stopped because the driver was convinced that it had derailed, and seismographs in the town of Irkutsk indicated a crash of earthquake proportions. Both the train and the town were 800 miles from the explosion. Whatever it was that had struck the Tunguska region of the Siberian forest land had exploded with a force never before imagined. Its shockwave travelled around the globe twice before it died out, and its general effect on the weather in the northern hemisphere was far-reaching. During the rest of June, it was quite possible to read the small print in the London Times at midnight. There were photographs of Stockholm taken at 1 o'clock in the morning by natural light, and a photograph of the Russian town of Novigrad taken at midnight looks like a bright summer afternoon. For some months, the world was treated to spectacular dawns and sunsets, as impressive as those that had been seen after the Great Krakatoa eruption in 1883. From this, as well as the various reports of unusual cloud formations over following months, it is fair to guess that the events thrown a great deal of dust into the atmosphere, as happens with volcanic eruptions, and notably atomic explosions. Perhaps the greatest and strangest aspect of the Great Siberian Explosion was that no one really paid much attention to it. Reports of the falling object were published in Siberian newspapers but did not spread any further. Meteorologists speculated that the strange weather, but no one came close to guessing its real cause. It was not until the Great War had been fought and the Russian Revolution had overthrown the Tsarist regime that the extraordinary events of that June day finally reached the general public. In 1921, as part of Lenin's general plan to place the USSR at the forefront of world science, the Soviet Academy of Sciences commissioned Leonid Kulik to investigate meteorites falling in Soviet territory. It was Kulik who stumbled upon the few brief reports from 10-year-old Siberian newspapers that finally led him to suspect that something extraordinary had happened in central Siberia in the summer of 1908. Kulik found the reports confusing and contradictory. None of them seemed to agree where the object had even exploded. Some even claimed that the meteor had later been found. But when his researchers began to collect eyewitness reports of the event, Kulik became convinced that whatever had exploded in Tunguska forest was certainly not a normal meteorite. These reports described how the ground had opened up to release a great pillar of fire and smoke. This pillar of fire and smoke burned bright in the sun. Distant huts were blown down and reindeers scattered. A man ploughing an open field felt his shirt burning on his back. Others described being badly sunburnt on one side of their face but not the other. Many people claimed to have been made temporarily deaf by the noise, or to have suffered long-term effects of shock. Yet, almost unbelievably, not a single person had been killed or seriously injured. Whatever it was that had produced the explosion had landed in one of the few places on Earth where its catastrophic effects would be minimized. A few hours later, it could have obliterated St. Petersburg, London, or even New York. Even if it had landed on the sea, tidal waves might have destroyed whole coastal regions. That day, the human race had escaped the greatest disaster in its history, and was not even aware of it. The passengers aboard the Trans-Siberian Railway were not the only people to witness this. The Yavenki tribesmen, 350 miles away, recorded a bright flame stabbing across the sky, moving at a erratic angle what we would now call 45 degrees before correcting itself, and then taking another 45-degree angle until it crashed somewhere across the plain, erupting in a geyser of smoke. Kulik discovered that a local meteorologist had made an estimated point of impact, and in 1927 he was given the necessary backing of the Academy of Sciences to find the point where the great meteorite had fallen. The Great Siberian Forest is one of the least accessible places on Earth. Even today, it remains largely unexplored, and there are whole areas that have only ever been surveyed from the air or on Google Earth. What settlements there are can be found on the banks of its large rivers, some of them miles in width. The winters are ferociously cold, and in the summer the ground becomes boggy and the air is filled with the hum of mosquitoes. Kulik was faced with an impossible task: to travel by horse and raft with no idea of exactly what to look for or where to look for it. In March 1927, he set off accompanied by 2 local guides who had witnessed the event, and after many setbacks, arrived on the banks of the Mekarita River in April. The Mekarita is the closest river to the impact point, and in 1927 formed a boundary between untouched forest and almost total devastation. On the first day, Kulik stood on a low hill and surveyed the destruction caused by the great Tunguska explosion. For as far as he could see to the north, perhaps a dozen miles, there was not one fully grown tree left standing. Every one had been flattened by the blast, and they lay like a slaughtered regiment, all pointing towards him. Yet it was obvious that he was looking at was only a fraction of the devastation, since all the trees were facing in the same direction as far as the horizon. The blast must have been far greater than even the wildest reports had suggested. Kulik wanted to explore the devastation. His 2 guides were terrified, and they refused to go on. So Kulik was forced to return with them to his point of origin, and it was not until June that he managed to return with 2 new companions. The expedition followed the line of broken trees for several days until they came to a natural amphitheatre in the hills and pitched camp. They spent the next few days surveying the surrounding area, and Kulik reached the conclusion that the cauldron, as he called it, was the centre of the blast. All around, the fallen trees faced away from it, and yet incredibly, some trees actually remained standing, although stripped and charred, at the very centre of the explosion. The full extent of the desolation was now apparent. From the river to its central point was a distance of 37 miles, so the blast had flattened more than 4,000 square miles of forest. Still working on the supposition that the explosion had been caused by a large meteorite, Kulik began searching the area for its remains. He thought he had achieved his object when he discovered a number of pits filled with water. He naturally assumed that they had been made by fragments of the exploding meteorite, yet when the holes were drained, they were found to be empty. One even had a tree stump at the bottom, proving that it had not been made by the blast. Kulik was to make 4 expeditions to the area of the explosion. Until his death, he remained convinced that it had been caused by an unusually large meteorite. Yet he never found the iron or rock fragments that provided him with the evidence he needed. In fact, he never succeeded in proving that anything had even struck the ground. There were evidence of 2 blast waves, the original explosion and the ballistic wave, and even of a brief flash fire, but there was no crater. The new evidence only deepened the riddle. An aerial survey in 1938 showed that only 770 square miles of forest had been flattened, and at the very point where the crater should have been, the original trees were still standing. That suggested the vagaries of an exploding bomb, rather than that of the impact of a giant meteor, like the one that made the 600-foot crater at Winslow, Arizona. Even the way the object fell to Earth was disputed. Over 700 eyewitnesses claimed that it changed course as it fell, saying that it was originally moving towards Lake Baikal before it swerved. Falling heavenly bodies have never been known to do this, nor is it possible to explain how it could have happened in terms of physical dynamics. Another curious puzzle about the explosion was its effect on the trees and insect life at the blast area. Trees that had always survived the explosion had either stopped growing or were shooting up at an accelerated rate. Later studies revealed new species of ants and other insects which are peculiar to the Tunguska blast region. But it was not until some years after Kulik's death in a German prisoner of war camp that scientists began to see similarities between the Tunguska event and another even more catastrophic explosion, the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Our knowledge of the atom bomb enables us to clear up many of the mysteries that baffle Kulik. The reason there was no crater was that the explosion had taken place above the ground. As with an atomic explosion, the standing trees at the central point of the explosion confirm this. At both Nagasaki and Hiroshima, buildings directly beneath the blast remained standing because the blast spread sideways. Atomic explosions produce disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field, and even today, the area around Tunguska explosion has been described as magnetic chaos. It seems clear that an electromagnetic hurricane of incredible strength has erupted from the Earth's magnetic field in this area. Eyewitness accounts of the cloud produced at the explosion again support the view that it was some kind of atomic device. It had the typical shape of the atomic mushroom cloud. Unfortunately, the one conclusive piece of evidence for the atom bomb theory is lacking. By the time the radiation levels were tested, more than 50 years later, they were actually normal. There was no radiation to be found. Later investigators also learned that Kulik had been mistaken in his theory about the water-filled holes. They were not caused by meteorite fragments, but by winter ice forcing its way to the surface through expansion, and then melting in the summer. Kulik's immense labours to drain the holes has sadly been a waste of time. Unfortunately, none of the new evidence that has been uncovered by Russian and even American expeditions has thrown light on the cause of the explosion. UFO enthusiasts favour the theory that the object was an alien spacecraft powered by atomic motors, which went out of control as it struck the Earth's atmosphere. It has been suggested that such a spacecraft might have headed towards Lake Baikal because it had need of fresh water to cool its nuclear reactors. Before it could reach its objectives, the reactor superheated and exploded. The scientific establishment is naturally inclined to discount this theory as pure fantasy, but some of its own hypotheses seem equally fantastic. University lecturers from the University of Texas have suggested the explosion was caused by a miniature black hole, a kind of whirlpool in space and time caused by the total collapse of the particles inside the atom. They calculated that their black hole would have passed straight through the Earth and come out on the other side, and the Russians were sufficiently impressed by the theory to research local newspapers in Iceland and Newfoundland for June 1980. But there was no sign of the Tunguska-like catastrophe that could have occurred if Jackson and Ryan were correct. Using the law of probability, it is almost certain that a small comet or meteor was responsible for the Great Tunguska explosion, not, as some have suggested, an exploding spacecraft or a miniature black hole. A comet seems less likely than a meteorite, since comets travel relatively slow and would have surely been seen approaching the Earth. Professor Zolotov, the leader of the 1959 expedition to Tunguska, calculated that, whatever the object was, it was about 100 feet in diameter and exploded about 3 miles above the ground with a force of 40 megatons, 2,000 times greater than the atomic bomb at Hiroshima.